recording now. So thank you for being here for our reflections on this meeting. And this webinar will be recorded and posted on re-aim.org. I'd like to ask if you wouldn't mind please muting your line if you're not speaking, but do feel free to use the chat box throughout the presentation and then to unmute and engage in dialogue with all of the panelists here today when we're in the Q&A and discussion portion of the presentation. So for today, the outline will be brief introductions and reflections from each of the members of our expert panel. Then I have a few questions that we have that will literally three, but I'm happy to save those if there's a more active dialogue from you all. So again, please feel free to ask. And then we'll move into questions from the audience. We will have, I will have an opportunity to reintroduce each panelist as we flip through the slides. As you can maybe tell, I'll be sharing my screen, so please feel free to just say when you're ready for me to advance the slides. So we will be reflecting on the 12th Annual Conference on the Science of Dissemination and Implementation in Health. I bet for many of you that seems like that's very few, and for some that seems like a lot. And we have the honor, I have the honor of moderating the panel with Dr. Russ Glasgow, who is a research professor and family medicine and the director of the Dissemination and Implementation Science Program of Accords at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Many of you will recognize him as one of the lead authors and people advancing re-aim throughout the last 20 years. So he will be sharing his lens as a senior investigator. And then we also have Dr. Bailey Houghtaling, who is an assistant professor of nutrition, School of Nutrition and Food Sciences at Louisiana State University as of this year. And this was her first time attending this conference or meeting, and so she'll be sharing that lens of a new investigator. And then we have Gila Neta, who is the Program Director of Implementation Science in the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences at the NCI, and she will be sharing perspectives of being part of the planning committee and some of those key takeaways from her role and lens at the NCI as well as on the planning committee. So without further ado, we'll get started, and I will just feel free to say advance if I can't surmise from what you're sharing. And there's the first slide.
Thanks, Samantha, and hi, everyone. So just want to clarify, I'm a program director in implementation science, not of implementation science, which just to clarify, so so actually it used to be Russ who was our Deputy Director of Implementation Science at NCI, and now it is David Chambers. So you can see here, my role on this panel is as serving as one of the co-chairs, which I do alongside with David Chambers and Lisa Simpson at Academy Health of the annual conference. And I have, so these bullet points essentially walk through some of the questions that Samantha had asked each of us to talk about. So I have attended the conference since 2013, but as Russ can tell you, in 2013, and as many of you who maybe have been attending the conference all along, that 2013 was the year we didn't actually have the large meeting, but instead had 3 parallel working meetings. That was the 6th annual gap year, so to speak. And that was because, you know, prior to that, for the first 5 years, it was a conference that was hosted by NIH and in co-sponsorship with the VA, right, Russ? That was always, yeah. And then I came on board, lucky me, the year that it became very difficult to host large conferences, and our conference had outgrown the ability for NIH to co-sponsor it. So Russ and David and others had the brilliant idea to partner with Academy Health. And so the year I came on board and we were organizing those working meetings was the year that all of the backstory of the new co-sponsorship between Academy Health and the NIH to host these huge annual meetings. I guess they've really grown exponentially since the first one. So, so I've been organizing that since 2014, where we launched our partnership with Academy Health. And as a co-chair, I oversee the planning committee, assembling a scientific advisory panel, recruiting track leads for our thematic tracks, organizing a technical assistance workshop, as well as organizing the proceedings from the meeting that are published in Implementation Science. And so the planning committee is essentially a committee of folks who represent the various co-sponsoring organizations. So in addition to Academy Health and members of the NIH, so that's staff across different institutes at the NIH. So we have representatives from NIMH, NHLBI, NCI, NIDA, Fogarty, and others. Basically the heavy hitters in terms of D&I grants. In addition, we have AHRQ, Kaiser, PCORI, RWJF, and the VA have representatives on the planning committee. And the role of the planning committee is to essentially put together the scientific agenda of the conference, discuss themes for the conference, speakers, and all of this work is informed by an external scientific advisory panel, which the planning committee nominates. And so these include folks like now Russ, or experts at academic institutions around the country and around the world who are leaders in implementation science. Our track leads, these are the thematic tracks, of which this year we had 9, and we tend to, historically being, basically since we've had tracks since the 8th annual, we've primarily pulled from sponsoring organizations, but now we're tending to mix more with extramural, investigators from universities as well. So that's essentially the main parts of the conference, and then new components that have evolved over the last year or two, and are sort of summarized here: doing workshops, having poster walks, best poster award, scholarships, and I assume everyone has attended the meeting, so they're familiar with the general format that we have. Panel and concurrent sessions, we have the plenary sessions, we have the poster sessions. So these are essentially the things that I'm involved with basically all year long in some capacity, some months busier than others. But on the next slide, I talk a little bit more about some of these new components, which are also related to the major takeaways. So I guess in my role as a co-chair, the takeaways that I focus on are how do we improve the meeting and how are we doing at improving the meeting? And so what I was very excited to see was that each year, since I've been organizing it with Academy Health, each year is record-breaking numbers. And this year we had over 1,400 registered. Last year we had over 1,300 registered for the first time. The year before that we had over 1,200 registered for the first time. So I'm seeing somewhat of a linear slope maybe, or not linear slope, but absolute numbers increasing. And what was also notable, each year we have more attendees. We also have more submissions. So each year we have record-breaking number of abstracts. For those of you who submitted for the 7th annual and were rejected, don't take it personally. I think we were so shocked by the number of submissions the first year we had our partnership with Academy Health. We were only prepared to accept a number of abstracts reflective of previous attendance. And our attendance was so high that we had to reject something like 75% of abstracts. So we have figured out ways to accommodate more people with more poster sessions, more concurrent sessions, and we're seeing more abstracts continue to come in. As well as at the start of each conference, David or Lisa will ask how many people are here for the first time who had never attended the conference before. And I think this year, I'd say at least a third of the hands went up in that first opening plenary session. So each year we're seeing more and more newcomers. Based on the evaluations based on the evaluations in terms of what folks want to see, as well as how highly they're scoring things, there really is this thirst for learning. That there was, now we've been offering a pre-conference orientation session with Kara Lewis, Renad Batis, Byron Powell, and this year we also had, oh goodness, I'm blanking on her name all of a sudden, from UPenn. But we've had a really hugely successful orientation session with standing room only, as well as workshops, so that there's an opportunity to go a little bit deeper into different methods or areas in implementation science. And these have been evaluated very highly, anecdotally, are well appreciated. I'd be curious to hear how folks on the call perceive these or find them useful, if they're topics folks would want to see addressed in the future. But we have moved more over the last 5 years to focus more on methods, as we did in this last year's conference, based on the feedback that people really want to dig more into how do we most effectively do this science. The other major takeaway was that I thought we had a brilliant keynote, and the thing that most excited me about the meeting was not just her topic on psychological safety and how important that is, thinking about organizational level levers, but how important it is at a conference when you're having workshops and you're having conversations about science to be able to feel you can freely discuss difficult, challenging concepts and not be afraid to ask hard questions or not be afraid to sound stupid because you don't know something you feel like you should know. If you should know it, you should be able to ask it and have a real conversation about it. So those were, I was really glad to see that Dr. Edmondson, Amy Edmondson, our keynote, sort of laid the, got us started on that note where, from my observations for the rest of the conference, there really was this tone of psychological safety where people could have those conversations and get the most out of the learning experience. And I think that's all I've got.
Thank you. So many follow-ups that we will definitely get back to during the Q&A. And next up is Russ Glasgow.
Okay, thanks, Samantha. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
All right. So I will try to be uncharacteristically brief here so that we have plenty of time for discussion. But I do want to say just a couple contextual factors. First of all, I see you've changed my slide, my title there, Samantha. I had old timer on there. And along with that, I just have to comment that this being like a month and a half or so after it, I'm lucky if I can remember what happened 2 days ago, let alone the meeting. So it was a bit challenging and fun to think back. Second, just contextually, as usual, Gila's far too modest, and behind the scenes, she's the one that really does the lion's share of the work and is the glue that holds everything together. The one implication for you all is she would be the key person if you have recommendations about things you'd like to see next year or feedback. She's actually the key person to do that. As you can see on the second bullet point here, I have been at all but one of the meetings, including the initial one, and just real briefly on that, how the field has changed. At this first meeting, I honestly would say a lot of people didn't see a need for implementation science. They really did think if they just published in the best journal, magic would happen. Second, a number of other people there, and I can say this now since I'm no longer at NIH, didn't really see this as a science. They just thought it was kind of getting the word out there and doing PR reports. And then finally, among a lot of the investigators that didn't meet the first two categories, they were pretty sure they were already doing it. despite the fact we think there were some gaps. This year, I attended for at least 3 reasons. One of them is NCI has also funded some new D&I centers that I feel is exciting because we were fortunate enough to be one of those, so I had to go there. But more importantly, it is my favorite meeting of the year, and both for the content and then the networking opportunities. So next slide, if you would, Samantha. My major takeaways here is that, first of all, being an old timer, it's really incredible to see how much the field has grown and really advanced over the last decade and the science of it. The theme I thought was incredibly relevant and important, and the notion of the 3 R's there I thought was really great. I also thought, even though there was this focus on methods, these were pragmatic methods. So I think that the science we're talking about, is much more applicable and much done in more in a partnership in a way that clinical and community leaders and folks can benefit from it. We'll talk a lot more about other areas, I think, in a little while, and our favorite things that we saw, but I was just really excited at the attention, particularly from other fields. I won't go into those here, but you can see those on the slide, and I'll mention one of them later, but these other, the integration and the kind of excitement and the innovation with other areas. And then finally, the emergence of, if you will, the next generation of D&I science leaders, certainly including Gila and some of the others of you on this call. And Gila, it's Renaud Batis was the other name that you were searching for from Penn, who was certainly one of those.
I said Renaud. It was Megan Lanefall.
Oh, my bad. Okay, my bad. I wasn't paying attention. Anyway, I think that's all I got.
The other UPenn person.
All right, that's all I got to say now. Maybe I was thinking about some of the behavioral economics things too much. Anyway, that's what I got for now.
Thank you. And then finally, we'll wrap up with Dr. Bailey Houghtaling's perspectives from the meeting.
Okay, great. Well, this is my first time engaging with the Re-AIM work group, so thank you so much for the invitation. I am a new assistant professor as of the year 2019. So my role has been really about carving out my research program here at LSU, and of course, learning as much as possible. So the learning curve has been steep, but it's been so much fun. Just to give you some background on the type of work I do, I really am in food environment. And so that broadly just means anywhere that consumers can access or make decisions related to what foods or beverages that they might purchase or consume. And really looking at policies, systems, and the types of environmental strategies that might improve diet quality. So really focused on public health nutrition approaches. And I have a real passion for understanding how these PSE approaches might improve the health outcomes of rural populations. And so within that broad scope, I got interested in dissemination and implementation science methods during my time at Virginia Tech, which is where I my PhD program and is how I know Dr. Harden. So I started exploring the D&I literature first within her graduate level course focused on relevant literature and methods related to the field. And my interest within the food environment has really been with key stakeholder populations or intermediaries, for example, food store owners, managers, and employees, and how their perspectives might influence the adoption, implementation, and sustainability of these healthy food retail innovations. And then certainly both, Virginia Tech and where I am now, LSU, are land grant institutions, and both have a very strong extension system where agents are going out into communities and rural areas and seeking to apply some of these evidence-based, healthy retail strategies. And so understanding their perspectives, navigating these relationships with retailers is something I'm also interested in. So that gives you a little bit of perspective on how I got introduced to some of these concepts, frameworks, and methods within the field. Next slide, please. So I was asked to talk a little bit about why I chose to attend. This D&I meeting in 2019 was my very first time attending the meeting. And I prioritized this year and following years professional development opportunities to help define my research program here at LSU. I wanted a little bit more discussion and introduction to D&I concepts and papers and new and emergent topics that are occurring. I didn't complete a postdoc, so I kind of wanted to make sure that I'm seeking out these opportunities as they come up. And I will also say, I guess I'll start with the next slide. Yeah, Samantha, thank you. So given that it was my first meeting, I certainly had a full schedule, and there was a ton of amazing talks, and I wish I could have, seen even more or heard even more. But one of the things that I really, really appreciated was the diversity and perspective from a variety of fields, and also from a variety of perspectives related to researchers, practitioners, stakeholders within communities, within healthcare settings, really talking about all of these pragmatic concepts or approaches. And I really appreciated that the discussion extended beyond any one setting or any one approach to really think about how these concepts are relevant to other settings or sectors. And along with that, the free sharing of ideas. So everyone was very open in talking about challenges and talking about problems that the field might need to overcome. So it was really refreshing to have that very open conversation, or to be able to hear all of these different ideas from all of these really great leaders in the field. The next point that I really, really enjoyed was the huge focus on context. And this may be certainly biased because I also did seek out all of the sessions that were focused on context, but it was really great to hear candid discussion regarding these different, contextual factors within settings that can't be standardized or controlled. And one of the quotes, I'm not sure who said it in one of the sessions, but mentioning that generalizability is a myth, and this certainly might be a discussion that's been ongoing in the field of D&I, but it was my first time hearing that and understanding some of the discussion around that, and it was very interesting and certainly inspired a lot of ideas moving forward in understanding how to start figuring out the different types of contextual factors that are important and how we can characterize those. So yeah, thanks again.
Thank you all. Just to kind of reflect on what was shared, there's both diversity of thought and background within the meeting itself, and that's also why we were able to have these different perspectives. So we hope that you feel as though you've gotten a brief overview of these key takeaways and the roles. I know I've learned a lot already, and we're only 30 minutes in, so thank you so much for your reflections. And one of the first questions that I was thinking about was if you could share your best or favorite session or moment throughout the conference and why that stood out to you. I know that and that's why I have this session, a moment may have occurred outside of, a technical session, but it was a conversation at lunch, or it was one of those networking moments, or something that you saw on Twitter that was a reflection of something happening within a session. So pretty broad question, but if you'd like to share your favorite moment or session.
You want to go in particular order, Samantha?
Sure, you can go first, Russ.
Okay, well, this was a really hard task for me. I was inclined to write down 3, not being good to follow orders, but I'll try and keep it focused on one here. It was tough. As Gila said, and to sneak another one in, I thought that the keynote was incredible, and particularly tied in both business and this notion of the fearless organization is something we can all learn from, I think, in our life as well as our research. But the one that I liked the best and Truth in Advertising. I was the invited discussion, but I had nothing to do with organizing it or the content. It was put together by Dr. Perez, I think it's Joles, I'm probably butchering her name, and Brian Mittman as the senior investigator on two important concepts in the field that I think are emerging but still don't have enough attention. The first one was on complex interventions and the characteristics of these and how they differ from the usual kind of more highly defined and often individual focused interventions that many of us grew up with, and some of the implications, particularly related to context with that. And then the second thing that was integrated there, and we're just starting to see publications led by this group, Brian and others, there is this distinction between form and function, of the form being the real specifics of how you deliver something or do it, and the function really being the core purpose. And this is actually being proposed as one way of getting out of the dilemma that we see that we have, at least I see in the field, about we all throw out the line about, well, you have to deliver the core components with fidelity. But quite often, you know, the truth behind the screen or the curtain is we don't know what those core components are. And I thought, but more often, I think we do know what the key function is, or what we're trying to accomplish here, and whether things are congruent with that or not. So to me, and I might actually come back to this later as one of the controversies, but I think that that was an interesting perspective.
Thanks, Russ. And then we'll go next with Bailey.
Sure. So echoing both other panelists, I also really enjoyed and found the keynote speaker talking about psychological safety very fascinating, and found myself trying to think through how these concepts might apply to food store settings and the type of work that I do. And there were also a lot of other really interesting sessions that focused on organizational capacity and different variables within organizational spaces that might impact innovations, which I found very fascinating. So certainly those types of were my favorite. I also really enjoyed how active all of the attendees of the conference were on Twitter. I find that I learn a lot on, looking through different posts while I'm at meetings, and also just, in general for new papers. And, I kind of was following along with respect to other sessions that I was interested in, but then had, ultimately chosen to go to a certain one. And then asking for, paper resources about ideas that I wasn't familiar with. And people were very responsive in sending links. So I think that the sharing of resources was really awesome, and something that I don't think I've experienced at a different type of meeting. So it felt very special.
Thank you, Bailey. And Gila, I'm sorry I didn't clarify before we started. Is it with a hard G or a soft G, so I'm not mispronouncing it every time?
Oh, you're pronouncing it right every time, and you might be the first. So thank you.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
And no, you shouldn't. You're sorry for doing it right. No.
for asking midway through, Heather.
No, I was almost going to say something, but I didn't want to embarrass you. But no, I'm very appreciative and impressed, honestly, that you got it totally right. So my favorite part of the meeting was I really liked the workshops, and so I was excited to be invited as helping with a workshop on pragmatic methods and a tool for designing pragmatic trials. So Wynn Norton and Merrick Warrenstein led a workshop where they roped me into help on the use of Précis2, which is a tool that perhaps everyone is already aware of. So I won't say much about it, but it stands for the Pragmatic Explanatory Continuum Indicator Summary. And 2 is for the second version of it, which is a validated version that Russ initially introduced me to back in 2013. And Merrick and Wynn and Kirsty Loudon, who Merrick and Kirsty were the original developers of the tool, and they've been working with Wynn Norton to develop a version of it that can be applied specifically to implementation trials. And the purpose of this tool is to help trialists design trials that are fit for their purpose. So if you want to do an efficacy trial or a more explanatory trial, you can do that. But if you want your trial to inform practice and be pragmatic, then this tool lays out 9 dimensions that you should be considering in order to design a more pragmatic trial. And so what was very cool about this workshop is not only did Wynn and Merrick talk about the reason to have this tool, the value of the tool and how it works, but then we worked through an example using a paper, a trial, to try to rate, to think about what are these 9 dimensions? What do they really mean? How do we think about making something more pragmatic or more explanatory? And, I think it's hard with these workshops, and you have over 100 people in the room, to have them be really engaged. And the value of the workshops and discussion forums is really to have an opportunity for attendees to be part of the discussion and to engage in the material and not just sit and listen. And so I think it was exciting to see people really engage with the material, have really, and even provide good fodder for thinking through how do we best use this tool? What are things that for the tool developers to be considering when they're thinking about the people who will ultimately be using the tool? And what are those challenges in thinking through how do you consider something more or less pragmatic given whatever context or intervention you are thinking about? So just really interesting conversations. And again, the idea of psychological safety came up because as we were working through the example, there were the answers that the various members of the audience or participants were offering. And then there was sort of the gold standard answer key that Wynn had. And those two things were sometimes very different. So it was fun to see how there could be an engaged discussion, and it wasn't just simply, oh, we're wrong, okay, oh well, but oh, maybe we're not actually wrong, maybe the key is wrong, or maybe we need to reconsider how we're thinking about this. So those conversations were really fun and interesting.
Samantha, if I could just jump in briefly to follow up on that, and maybe we could start engaging those listening if this piques their curiosity to get forward, so it isn't just us talking. But just to follow up on that, and again, truth in advertising, I'm a huge fan of Précis and the work that's been done there. But to me, some of the more nuanced issues, when you actually try to apply Précis to, which I'd really encourage everybody to do, thinking about your next grant. It started out being focused on its use as a planning tool for either a study, or a grant, is the impact of the perspective of the stakeholder who's doing that. And often in the work that we've been involved with, the earlier version of it, it really depends whether you're a frontline person out there delivering it, or investigator. Second, I think it's fascinating to see, and we have far too little research, I think, on changes over time. This notion from what you think the design's going to be, but then related to one of the other themes of the meeting is we almost always adapt that. I would say generally appropriately over time, but sometimes not to kind of meet this fit purpose that Gila was talking about. And then the final one is this, from my perspective, and others, this might be the key for others to comment, is this is related to, but in some ways an alternative way to reflect or communicate what you're doing as compared to our usual thinking about hybrid effectiveness intervention trials, which is much more widely used, at least in the US, I think.
Yeah, thank you for those reflections. I think one of the reasons I'm most excited about being a part of this field is that we are challenging the current epistemology and how we're just knowing what we know, or as Bailey mentioned, hearing for the first time, generalizability may be a myth. And so I love that idea of that honest, open exchange that even happened during the session, where we were able to, or you all were able to create an environment that didn't go with the gold standard. I do feel free to unmute your line and jump in on those key sessions and takeaways. We do have a comment in the chat box already from Joanne asking for a little bit more of a deep dive into the form and function aspect, if the three of you would like to comment on that. And I might add specifically, because what you propose in a grant might not 100% match what's in the real world, since we also have a program director here, it would be great to hear how the three of you have either successfully talked about changes over time, or those who are on the line, if you could unmute and share how you've successfully packaged that, kind of knowing the dynamic world of these complex issues and systems. And if we can circle that back to form and function so that we get that for Joanne as well.
Well, let's hear, I think I kind of gave part of my interpretation of it, so I'd love to hear from others. I'll let others go first.
Don't see anyone unmuting themselves quite yet.
Well, to fill the gap then, since nobody else is jumping in, I just really like the concept. And by the way, there is a recent publication on this. I'm blocking on where now, but we'll be sure and send it out in the follow-up unless somebody has it in front of them. Frankly, our group discussed it. As I said, I can't remember anything a week ago, but I see there's a few people from our group. Maybe you could share at least the citation now and we can make it available. But I just find it really thoughtful, and I think it relates to one of the other current directions in the field of looking at mechanisms. And in a way, I think that's really what we're talking about in the function. What are you trying to do right here? And to me, again, from an old timer's perspective, this is really refreshing because I think it's an alternative to the focus we originally had, which comes from the traditional clinical trials perspective of the 400-page protocol. You know, and doing good science had to do with doing what was said on page 385 in the order that it was done, in the session that it was done, instead of thinking, you know, really ahead about the function. And I might add the function both, I think, of the intervention component and then also the implementation strategy. And I think that's also an evolving area that's receiving more attention, is the distinction between those two. And those of you on chat, I see my colleague Bethany has just put up the citation. Thank you, Bethany.
Thank you, Bethany. Okay, so the next question, just because I know many of you have mentioned the kind of the one that I asked about before. What I'm really interested in is the potential most controversial thing that you heard, and then maybe how the group dynamic or a small conversation outside of that was resolved. I think this points back to that psychological safety, the being within an emergent field and how you navigate that, and how just whatever your most controversial moment was and how you saw that play out in the discussion, whether it was in person or via Twitter or however it was potentially resolved, or if it has gone unresolved. And this time, let's go ahead and start with Bailey with your most controversial moment.
Sure. So I'm not quite sure that I have a most controversial, although I do think among some circles the generalizability may be a myth comment would be. But I do, so the way that I was going to respond to this question is, during some of the conversations after the talks and presentations that I chose to attend, it seemed like there was at times a lot of discussion regarding which types of approaches or strategies might be considered implementation science. So, kind of some confusion about the parameters of the field and what qualifies and what doesn't. And as a new investigator, I found that, very fascinating. It is a very diverse field, and there's new things coming out all the time, and it's really difficult to stay abreast of all of the emerging information. And of course, it may also be because there were so many new people, as we've heard discussed this year in comparison to other years. So I'm not quite sure that that's controversial, but certainly something that I noticed.
Thanks, Bailey. And then Gila.
Sure. So I'm glad I get to go before Russ, because I'm wondering if Russ is going to say the same thing. I would say the plenary session on natural laboratories in implementation science, I think this term natural laboratories has been somewhat controversial in various places where it's been discussed. And Russ, this also came up at the consortium meeting. But I think, the labels we use to describe things, it will often depend on who your audience is. So the concept natural laboratories, I think, came up with sort of an NIH perspective in mind, or a research perspective in mind, but in implementation science, where we're engaging and collaborating with stakeholders, sometimes this connotation of laboratory is not, it's not as good a term, depending on who you're talking to. So I think, I'm not sure that it was a resolved issue, except to recognize that the terms we use may shift depending on who we're talking to. But I think the point is, that I think that it's an important discussion to have, and to define what we mean by these things, and with an understanding of the terms we're using to describe them, may not always, they may vary by who you're talking. You may want to consider changing the names depending on who you're talking to.
I'd love to ask just a follow-up about that, as I do, as Bailey mentioned, teach a graduate level course in dissemination implementation science. And I think we spend a lot of time speaking to the need to define all of these things, even within your papers and within your grants, to make sure that, that's part of dissemination, is making sure we're on the same page as to what we're talking about. But knowing that, but also knowing like word limitations and things like that, is the best solution to just add, say what you mean and add citations so they can see what you mean? Or do you spend the real estate in a grant or in a paper defining it?
Right. So I guess that's another issue. I think, well, you don't want in your grants, you don't want to leave anything that's critical to justifying and describing your approach for a reviewer to have to look up. So you would want to be explicit about that. But I think that the controversy with this terminology laboratory, it's maybe a different issue. And I think this idea of the community feeling like they're guinea pigs as opposed to being equal and significant collaborators, So I think there was some discussion in the plenary around the use of the word laboratory versus co-laboratory versus something else.
Let me jump in there too. I certainly
Great.
agree with that. And actually, I think that's going to come up even more so in an event that Gila can tell you a little more about than I can now, I think. But just to toss out there, this September, there's going to be a national meeting for a consortium that David Chambers likes to call the Big Tent at Wake Forest. I don't have the exact dates here, but I'm sure this issue is going to come up more of implementation laboratories, or however we want to frame this, whether these are collaborative partnerships or whatever. I do have my own opinions about this, and I do think words matter on this, but I think this is one of the evolving areas in the field. I'd like, though, to go back to something Bailey said, rather than that one that I think is really, I think I'd say provocative. I don't know if it's controversial. It's too new to really be there, and it certainly hasn't been worked out, but I think is interesting. And at some point, quite honestly, I think maybe people haven't grasped all of the underlying implications of it. And that's the tension between context, which, as Bailey said, was one of the key functions, and I think one of the hot areas in our science, with mechanism, the study of mechanisms, which is also another huge, and was another theme of the meeting, and is going to be the theme of many things to come. But to me, it relates maybe to the issue that Bailey mentioned about, if you will, the generalizability myth there. And it's this notion of mechanisms, which I think is critically important to understand, both in terms of the intervention and implementation science. But I think we need to be really humble and sophisticated about how we approach study of mechanisms. In my biased opinion, the way we have in the past, which is looked at like a strict linear notion about one component is going to impact one outcome invariant across context, I think just it really has a lot of limitations, and at least what I've seen, generally is really lacking. Now, there are some real exciting approaches. I think we saw some at CERC about really how to take into account other more sophisticated modeling approaches, and especially the multi-level context to do that by Nate Williams and others in the field. But I'll stop there. I'm probably pontificating, as Samantha said in her handout, a little too much. So.
No, I think it's good. Wherever it goes, we have to understand all of these components together. And we are at just 7 minutes to go. So if somebody would like to share, there have been kind of questions to the audience, particularly related to, did you go to a workshop that was significant for your work, or if you have any feedback or any questions, or if it was your first meeting as well, what you left with that was most meaningful, because this is a great opportunity for that two-way communication, as Russ mentioned earlier. And we'll just kind of hold space for that. So if you'd like to unmute or add that to the chat box. And if we don't hear, our final kind of pre-thought question was related to, if someone was new to the field, what do you hope that they gained from attendance this year? And we'll just start back with Russ again.
Well, real briefly, I think we've covered most of it, but I think it's just the excitement, the new areas of investigation, the opportunities, and actually I honestly do feel, compared to a lot of places and fields, I've seen the collegiality. Content-wise, I think one other thing we haven't had a chance to address that I think is really exciting, we heard a whole lot about there, and I think people can take away, is the issue of adaptations and documenting, understanding, and maybe even guiding those instead of, Brian Mittman, again, provocatively has said, as opposed to ignoring or suppressing them. And there's a lot of exciting work, including the new PCORI guidelines for addressing adaptations that I'd refer people to.
Thanks, Russ. Bailey?
Sure. Well, as someone so new to the field and to this meeting, I guess I didn't necessarily think going into it what I hoped would come out of it. But I think from the perspective of a new investigator, I have a lot of different ideas and considerations that I would not have considered or thought of otherwise. I have, a ton of new people that I follow on Twitter to try and stay abreast of the emergent information. I have a giant stack of 2 read papers that I'm working through, and a lot of insight into various other professional development opportunities that occur within the D&I space all over the country, which I'm looking into and seeing how it might fit within my overall professional development plan. So those are some of the key things that I left with that I think are very beneficial to helping move, really great research that's pragmatic and relevant and rigorous forward. So.
Thank you, Bailey. And Gila?
Yeah, I think, well, I'm thinking 2 things. One, I was excited about the energy and discussions and side discussions around measures in the field and methods in the field and advancing those things, and specifically around economic evaluation and cost. But I also think, as one of the chairs and thinking about how do we continue to improve the meeting, one thing that I'm still thinking about and would love input on in general by email or whatever is how do we increase networking opportunities so that newcomers to the field or first timers to the conference can be, can have as many opportunities as possible to network with folks and get involved in activities and enhance collaboration. So those are some of the things I guess I was leaving with.
Can I add one point just as a newcomer in response to your question? And I don't know if other people would feel the same, but, and there were so many talks that were very interesting and very relevant and applicable to the type of community work that I do. And so certainly it's not a complaint that finding one to go to was difficult, but I think that's a good sign of any conference that you go to. But in terms of like new investigator networking or opportunities, maybe some signposting in the agenda that really points out to those new to the field or new attendees which sessions would be really key for them to attend, as kind of sort of giving suggestions on how they might structure their time at the conference in terms of content or workshops or things like that might be helpful.
That was actually a comment in one of the evaluations. I'm wondering, Bailey, if you just outed yourself or if you're just echoing what others have also suggested, because I thought it was a great suggestion.
No, actually, I did fill out an evaluation, but I did not write that. So it's something that I would have been thinking about as I've, was charged with reflecting on my experience as part of this webinar. And then, it prompted me to say so in response to some of the things that you just shared. So no, but it seems as though others may share the same ideas. So
great. Good to reinforce that. We'll see what we can do to try to do our best to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking about that when you mentioned how well attended and well received the orientation session was. I think this was my 5th time attending, and I still speak with my students before or colleagues before, and I say, I'm going to this one, if you could go to this one, and we can debrief about it over lunch, and it feels really exciting, but also a little overwhelming to get to everything. And I've had a couple of conversations with folks who were like, that was amazing, but I also left a little tired because there was so much to digest. So that's really good feedback, that there's so many opportunities for learning and growing and sharing and networking. And we appreciate all of your shares and experience and expertise on the panel, as well as those of you who have already linked to a PDF of the core functions and forms in the complex health interventions document that's in this, the group chat, as well as the link to the praces2.org as a helpful resource. If you're not already on the REAIM listserv, feel free to send myself to send me an email, and I can get you added to that. And you can also just visit re-aim.org and fill that out online as well. And we look forward to potentially seeing you all on our next webinar. So thank you all so much for your time and attention, and have a great day.
Great. Thanks.